The Saturn-Neptune conjunction on February 20th is by far one of the most impactful, life-altering transits that we're going to be experiencing in all of 2026. And here to talk about what it means for the collective is the one and only Dan Waits from World Astrology Report. Welcome, Dan, and thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you here because I love watching your videos. You are probably my favorite mundane astrologer. So, anyone out here who doesn't know about Dan's work, he does a really amazing job of analyzing what's going on, the historical precedent. He's also just a really knowledgeable, well-versed astrologer. And he does mundane astrology, which is looking at world events and making predictions for world events. And he tends to be quite accurate in doing so. And so, I'm super excited to have Dan here to talk about the Saturn Neptune energy because that's going to be a huge one for shifting the course, I think, of our entire planet, like everything that's going on in the world. So, yeah, I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, me too. I've been talking and thinking about this conjunction for quite a while, so it's always fun to talk some more about it.
Yeah. And so I think we should probably start with the basics. So Saturn and Neptune are shifting into the sign of Aries, which is Saturn's fall, which I think is probably the most interesting part to me, at least. So yeah, I'd like to get a little bit of your perspective on what that means, Saturn moving into Aries and that Neptune energy, which is very incongruent with Saturn's structure and rigidity and solidity, right? It's like an energy of Neptune dissolving all of that Saturnian structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, these conjunctions come around every 36 years, something like that. And as you say, Saturn and Neptune, they're not exactly happy bedfellows, I think it's fair to say. Saturn is much more related to that which is concrete and crystallized and manifest and stable and structured. And Neptune, as you say, dissolves Saturn essentially. You get these periods with Saturn Neptune of kind of dissolution or like disillusion, like the illusions that we operate under kind of get dissolved and new ones take their place, or structures that we rely on dissolved, and there's a period where things aren't so stable; they're a bit soggy, so to speak. And perhaps some of your viewers have noticed this, depending on where these planets are, hitting their charts. They might have noticed that certain parts of their lives have become a little bit less reliable, less
Mhm.
less stable. And but the problem with the Saturn Neptune dynamic as well is that Neptune is inherently confusing and mystifying as well. So there's also this sense of like where things aren't stable and they're dissolved partially, but we don't know the way forward. You don't know how to kind of put things back together, so to speak. And that's something that I've noticed. I don't know about you, but in a lot of clients I've talked to, there's this sense of not quite knowing how to move forward because of this sort of Neptunian fog around the Saturnian. And then we have Saturn, as you say, and Neptune moving into Aries, which is a big switch because we're moving from the last sign of the zodiac into the first. And Pisces and Aries are probably about as different as two signs could be. And so it's a very big shift in energies. As you say, Saturn is in full in Aries. So it's not a place where Saturn is particularly effective.
Mhm.
Saturn likes to build structures and to crystallize things, but Aries is this very fast moving, energetic, martial sign. So it doesn't, that too doesn't really bode super well for stability. And I think Saturn can be quite a harsh influence in Aries at times as well. It's kind of really putting a lot of pressure on um, performance and proving oneself um, and assertion and being able to be who we are. It's like it's not so friendly there in certain respects, and so yeah, it's a big change in energy, and I think you can maybe detect it already in the vibes around the world at the moment.
Absolutely. And this isn't something that has just begun. We started to feel this back in 2025. And I don't know about you and the work that you've done with your clients, but something that I've had come up a lot is this energy of roadblocks and hurdles and challenges that come up very quickly and demand really quick, like almost like you have to address it faster than you're ready to. Like something comes up, it's all of the sudden, and you have to kind of scramble to deal with the repercussions of what just happened. And you're not able to actually fix it all the way or fix it properly because you have to do it in this way that's very hasty. And so that I think is it speaks to the fact that Saturn's at its fall in Aries and Saturn's in the domain of Mars because Mars wants things to happen really fast. Saturn is kind of like, I want to take my time, do things the right way. And Saturn's lessons, when it's in its fall, tend to come up in a way that are not super productive. Like Saturn in Capricorn, for example, you'll have hurdles and roadblocks and things that come up that they seem to have some sort of purpose or end goal, or they're building to something at least. But Saturn and Aries, it's just kind of like, what the heck is this? Now I have to deal
Yeah.
with this problem, and it doesn't seem like I'm really getting much out of this.
Yeah, it's that dynamic of a mismatch in speed
Yeah.
between slow Saturn, fast Aries, and when a planet is out of sorts a little bit in a sign, it's not so productive, and so it's going to be difficult, not impossible, but harder work to build structures and so forth with Saturn in Aries. It's difficult for it to accomplish that and can't really do it. So as you say, in a sign like Capricorn, where progress can kind of be made at a more continual basis, slow and steady, but nevertheless things build. Aries is going to be this perhaps frustration, yeah, that relates to that mismatch in speed, and when events aren't moving at the speed that you want them to, i.e., they're moving too fast, as you say, and you're forced to react when you wanted to take your time over something.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then with Neptune moving into Aries, what do you see for that? Because Neptune and Aries is kind of a mismatch too. Like Neptune being in Pisces kind of makes sense. In modern astrology, at least, there's an affinity with Neptune in the sign of Pisces. Neptune is very spiritual, very watery, very malleable, and so is the sign of Pisces. So they kind of, tend to mesh well together, at least to a certain extent. And then we move into this like hot, dry, fast, very willpower, action oriented Aries. What does that do?
Yeah, it's a pretty big shift, I think, and you can start to see things in the air a little bit because there's this much hotter, and I would say maybe more masculine kind of energy that's asserting itself more and more in the collective sphere. I mean, Neptune has to do with where our ideals are and who we see as ideal or heroic, and what we imagine the good to look like, and things of that kind. And it's such a big shift, as you say, between Pisces and Aries. Neptune, I think, was very powerful in Pisces, and in a certain sense, I don't tend to look at any transit as ultimately good or bad, right? They have manifestations that we find productive and useful, and others that we don't, perhaps. But there's so much subjectivity that comes into that, and I think it's just wise to not kind of attach those kinds of value judgments to these things. But yeah, Neptune in Pisces has really encouraged people to look at the stories of their lives and to examine traumas. Everybody's sort of using that language these days. There's noticeable changes to the public sphere and what was deemed to be kind of acceptable. We had all this kind of I don't want to get into the weeds of this, but that we had this sort of these new ideas, say about diversity and sexuality and all this kind of stuff. Some of them that weren't necessarily new, but that were promulgated and really shaped discourse in a way that they hadn't so much in the past, and quite intensely.
Mhm.
And sort of there was this very kind of idealistic push in the culture, whereas Neptune moving into Aries is a very sharp shift. Although that said, I don't think Neptune is a planet that you feel sharply when it changes. It sort of changes a bit more gradually, so it's harder to detect Neptune's sign shifts as kind of immediate events. Although you can if you're looking closely at things, but it's a rather subtle planet that kind of builds in its influence over time.
Mhm.
And I think its sign shifts blend into one as well a little bit, like they merge into one another. So the Neptune and Aries vibe, again, I think this much more active, outward facing, perhaps masculine. We'll probably see young men playing much more of a role in the culture, just based on
Mm.
the Aries archetype, which is this very young energy and ruled by Mars. So it's going to feel different, but I think that new impulse has been building for a while. It's not exactly new. It's kind of an undercurrent, perhaps, through the Neptune in Pisces era, and we're going to see things will start to feel more and more different. I think over the years, maybe not. We won't necessarily notice it overnight, but you're just going to feel it building and building and building. I think until the world will feel very different by the end of that Neptune and Aries transit in 2039, I think it is.
Yeah. Okay. So with Saturn and Neptune coming into Aries at the exact same time, do you feel like we'll experience that Neptune transit a little bit sharper because it's being also activated by that Saturn conjunction? Like, is this going to feel different than a normal transition?
I would think so. Yeah, I think Saturn accentuates and puts more pressure on that shift. So, and it will also concretize events a bit more. I think, and ordinarily, Neptune changing sign wouldn't be something that would be super immediately noticeable in world
Yeah.
events. If you're following popular culture, you start to notice shifts. I think one of the major things that came when Neptune moved into Pisces soon after was the launch of Instagram and Facebook
Ooh.
buying Instagram. And that was something that really characterized the Neptune and Pisces era, right? Instagram, this app that's really about image, and that's pure Neptune, really. But with Saturn going into Aries with Neptune and with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, yeah, I think it will feel much more noticeable and more intense, and we'll see it reflected in world events much more than you ordinarily would with a Neptune shift.
That makes sense because Saturn would make things more tangible and like you can see it, you can feel it, you can touch it. It's there. Whereas Neptune, not so much, right?
Yeah, that's right. Although, I say that, but then, you can always find counterexamples, actually. The last time that Neptune moved into Aries, I think it was 1860. And soon after, I think it was the second ingress, which coincided with the breakout of the American Civil War. And
Oh
that
yeah.
was an instance of Neptune changing sign and something very significant happening immediately. So it can happen like that.
Okay. And then in this particular circumstance, we're going to have this conjunction happening at 0 degrees in the sign of Aries, which is also known as the world point. What would you say about how that alters things?
Yeah, the world points are 0 degrees of the four cardinal signs. And according to some schools of astrology, things that trigger those so-called world points, they have a much more universal global effect. So they don't just signify lots of different things happening in sort of small ways in around the world, but the events have a universal significance. I think a really good example of how this is already manifested very obviously is Trump's tariffs, which he really brought in 2025. And
Yeah.
this is very purely Saturn Neptune. We have Neptune being this planet of universal flow, you can imagine that the global trade system is this sort of Neptunian system, this oceanic system, which is literally based on the oceans, of course. And we have goods flowing around the world, but then Saturn says, no, we're putting blocks, we're
Yeah.
restricting the flow of things. And these tariffs have, of course, had an effect on the entire world. They've been applied on countries all over the planet, perhaps every country, or almost every country, to greater or lesser degree. So it's a really clear example of how these world points manifest. We have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction right on one of these world points, 0 degrees of Aries, and we have this very Saturn-Neptune dynamic that's affecting the entire planet.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I didn't realize that the tariffs were connected to the Saturn-Neptune energy. And we had this, so this started back in 2025. So, kind of as a lead into where things are going, what have you seen so far that you feel is connected to this Saturn-Neptune energy before it's come exact, but when it was getting close last year?
Yeah, it started to get close in spring of 2025, and Neptune moved into Aries first. But we really noticed a shift, I think, in late May, or roughly May, late May, early June, when Saturn also moved into Aries. And then we had both planets in the same sign in the very early degrees of Aries. And there was, I think, a quite heavy shift in the tone of world events at that time, in a few different places. But a couple of examples were that I think very soon after that shift, you had this situation in LA with regards protests against ICE operations,
Mhm.
and Trump moving in federal troops, and this big face off between the state of California and the federal government over this issue. And there were all these headlines, these very kind of dramatic headlines. And we have to take, I think, the way the press covers things with a pinch of salt a little bit these days, because everything's massively sensationalized. But nevertheless, there were all these headlines about civil war in the US. And it was immediately after Saturn joined Neptune in Aries. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this resonance with Neptune in Aries because Neptune's last transit through Aries coincided with the US Civil War. So
Yeah.
you kind of have to wonder whether the journalists who are writing these things are aware of the astrology or have somehow picked up on it, because it's quite interesting if you have an astrological awareness when they say
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah, and so there was that, and then there was also a noticeable shift in the Ukraine conflict as well. I think the tone and what was happening there, it seemed to intensify quite a lot as soon as Saturn moved into Aries. Obviously, this conflict's been going on since 2022, or arguably 2014, depending on how you want to count it. But there was a real much greater intensity detectable as soon as Saturn changed sign. There were news reports about how supposedly the Ukrainians had tried to assassinate Vladimir Putin in his helicopter, and the Russians had launched this massive attack on Kiev. And it was just really noticeable the greater intensity. And of course, Aries is this martial sign, this
Yeah.
sign of action and ruled by the war planet Mars. And so it really reflected that sign change quite heavily. So those were some things that I noticed in this kind of preview period. And it's also interesting that it was Russia that had come up as well, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because I think, as maybe a few of your viewers will already know, there's this big resonance between the Saturn-Neptune cycle and Russian history. You
Yeah.
can go back very far in time and see correlations between Saturn-Neptune conjunctions and aspects and major events in Russian history. It just resonates to that cycle. And as soon as Saturn joined Neptune in Aries, we had these really noticeable, intense developments over there. And so it's very on the nose astrology.
Yeah. And the other thing I noticed, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but there seems to be a theme, especially the last few cycles, around communism.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There is a historical correlation with Saturn-Neptune conjunctions and developments in communism and socialism. Um, you have to think, why is that? And I think it has to do with the idea that Neptune is this planet of ideals and universalism and collectivism. And Saturn is this concretizing, pressurizing, manifesting influence. So with Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, you get these attempts to make manifest the ideal, so to speak, which communism is arguably this attempt to bring to earth this kind of spiritual ideal of equality. And if you go back into the past, I think 1846, I might be remembering that, but I think Karl Marx was working on the Communist Manifesto at the time of one of these conjunctions.
Yeah, I
And
remember actually seeing that too.
yeah, yeah. And then you fast forward a bit and you go to 1917 and we have the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, which is the initiation of this big communist experiment in Russia. And then you can forward to 1953 at the next set of conjunctions, and you have the death of Stalin, which is a very significant event for the USSR because it's a kind of dissolution of the previous order, Stalin's very hard totalitarian order, and then a new phase, perhaps somewhat less authoritarian, although still highly authoritarian, but a dissolution and recongealing of the order in Russia, 1953. And then you can forward to the next Saturn-Neptune conjunction, 1989. This was actually a triple conjunction, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, so it was a bit more dramatic than usual. Had a bit more sort of fast-moving Uranian feel to it, I think, because 1989 was the year that the Berlin Wall fell, which was really the event that then precipitated the fall of the Soviet Union in the next couple of years as well. So yes, it always comes up, communism, socialism, and the history of Russia, and obviously those two things are linked in the past. So it's intriguing knowing that pattern, and then knowing that there's a war, of course, involving Russia and Ukraine has captured the attention of the world for a few years now. Also, just I think there's been at least to some extent, a rise in the popularity of socialism as well. And a milestone, for example, you have Zoran Mamdani getting elected as the mayor of New York on a socialist platform. That's quite significant. And it's also, I think, redolent of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction.
That is very interesting. And not to put like scary ideas in anyone's head, but the Saturn-Neptune energy combined with the Aries energy in my brain gives me this idea of like communist dictatorship. And maybe I'm, just taking all these archetypes and smushing them together, and that's not the real reality of it. But in my mind, it seems like a potential. I don't know if you think that too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely authoritarian. I think there's no doubt about that. It feels quite communist dictatorship, yeah, or like might makes right. Kind of just the assertion of pure power becomes how things are done. You kind of notice that a little bit with what happened recently in Venezuela,
Yeah.
with the extraction of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and putting him on trial and so forth. That's not entirely new. It's not like the US has never done anything like that before. It's done similar things in the past. For example, you could come up with a few, but the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani, for example, was just a kind of decapitation attack. It's done similar things. Panama is another place, 1989. But what's different, I think, is that there's Trump did that, but he didn't really make any reference to international law, or there was no kind of attempting to get international institutions on board with what he wanted to do. It was just kind of, we're doing this because we can. We have the power to do this, and we've decided it's in our interests or the world's interests or whatever. So we're going to do this. We're going to act, and we're going to use our power. And that feels very Aries, I think, to me. Saturn in Aries, Saturn Neptune in Aries, even it feels like we're sort of seeing the initiation of a new more might makes right kind of world order, where it's a bit like the different countries, the different states that will just be acting in their own interests. There will be much less reference to collectivism and international law and so forth. It's it's almost, I've almost kind of wondered if it's kind of the US is moving into its kind of explicitly like imperial phase a little bit. It's
Mm.
kind of like we're done with pretending that we care what the world thinks. This is what we're going to do. And so, there's a lot of angles you can come at it, but yeah, that communist dictatorship or just kind of general sort of authoritarianism definitely get that feel from this. Yeah.
That's super interesting. Also because of the implications for oil, and Neptune does rule oil, right? And so it was
Yeah.
just like, this is what we're doing, and we're doing it, for this reason, but also for oil. The end. Like it
Yes.
was so like transparent and just like blunt. Like, it was just very, yeah, that's not
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah, that was definitely the difference. I think you're right. Yes, the Neptune does rule oil, and you've seen similar things. People said that the Iraq War of George W. Bush, for example, 2003, said that was
Yeah.
all about oil, and it probably was in part about oil. But Bush never said that. It
Yeah,
was all
no,
just.
he really never said that.
He never said that. It was all kind of trying to get the UN to agree that Iraq had non-existent weapons of mass destruction and all that stuff. It was still kind of, let's be real. It wasn't that different. It was still kind of, we're going to do what we want, but there was more kind of pretense, I think. So if you were to take a more, okay, in Trump's defense, you might say, well, he's just stripped out the bullshit and is now just nakedly saying this is what we're doing because we want to, and we want to control the oil industry and blah blah blah. But yeah, these Saturn Neptune conjunctions, they do seem to sometimes bring up the theme of oil, and you can see that in another way actually if you look at the history of Iran, because like Russia, Iran also resonates to the Saturn Neptune cycle in quite a similar way. It's pretty interesting. If you go back to 1989, the Saturn Neptune conjunction of that year when the Berlin Wall fell, this was the year when the supreme leader of Iran, who led the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, he died and was replaced by the current supreme leader, who has quite a similar name, but another Ayatollah Khomeini, spelt slightly differently. So they've only ever had two leaders, supreme leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the second one took over from the first in 1989 at one of these Saturn Neptune conjunctions. So similar to what we saw with Stalin, there's a sort of dissolution or change in the order there. Then if you go back to 1953, the US and Britain basically supported a coup in Iran and ousted the prime minister of the country, Mossadegh, and brought in a new prime minister, which empowered the Shah and ultimately led to the revolution in 1979. But if you look at why they did that, part of the reason was that Mossadegh had nationalized the oil industry in Iran and had
Oh,
basically taken British-controlled resources from British-controlled oil corporations. And if you go back to 1917, you also see something similar. The British were kind of agitating to kind of take control of Iran. They wanted their hands on the vast oil resources. And yeah, so oil does come up over and over again. And also Iran in general just seems to resonate to this cycle. And we're seeing this big event now in Iran, these huge protests.
interesting. Okay, so we have Russia, we have Iran, we have oil, we have communism. Are there any other major themes and developments that we're missing before we lead into kind of the predictions?
I think we've covered some of the major ones there, but there are some charts that Saturn Neptune, this conjunction, is hitting quite directly, because there are charts that have sensitive points or their angles at 0 degrees of Aries, where the conjunction is coming, or very close to there. And one of the charts is the United States.
Yeah.
Right, depending on which chart you use for the United States, but the US Sibley chart, which is very popular, it has an IC, which is signifier of the foundations of the country, or the infrastructure, the homeland, and so forth, is at 1 degrees of Aries. So the Saturn Neptune conjunction is right there. So again, if you think back to what I said before about how you saw this situation in LA and this standoff between the federal government and the state government, the US chart is really directly hit by that Saturn Neptune conjunction. And what's the theme of contention around what happened there? Well, the big theme of the moment is immigration, and that's another, I think, manifestation of Saturn Neptune. We've had a lot, quite a rise, I think, in immigration and sort of people flow, let's say, with Neptune in Pisces. But then Saturn came into Pisces in 2023, and we've started to see a lot more opposition to free immigration, or to relatively free immigration. And there's a lot of it's an issue of contention all over the world, including the US. And what is the big debate? It's kind of what to do about illegal immigrants and so forth, right? And how much to enforce the borders. And there are different schools of thought with that, and that's where the tension between the federal government and the state government is coming. And it's like, do we enforce the borders? And that also feels very Saturn Neptune, right? Saturn being the borders, the limits of something, the walls, and Neptune dissolving the walls, or trying to. So yeah, immigration, I think, really seems to be a Saturn Neptune theme. And it's obviously it's not just the US, it's a bone of contention all over the place. And you almost see this shift from Pisces to Aries, in that Pisces is this kind of sign of like flow, and let's just, we're all the same, let's just let everybody flow around and let people flow, goods flow, one big oceanic realm of Pisces. Whereas Aries is much more concerned with the identity, with the self, with sovereignty. So there's this kind of this conflict, let's say, over these questions of migration, how much to enforce borders, sovereignty, identity. People are sort of saying, no, we're asserting our identity, our sovereignty, and saying, no, you can't come into this country, or you need to leave, or whatever it is, right? So you can kind of see that split and that shift right there in just kind of this issue, and how it's become so all pervading, and everybody's talking about it right now. And that's another Saturn Neptune thing, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Immigration. Okay, so we have all of our themes and we've talked about a lot of what's happened so far. Let's talk about what comes next.
Yeah, let's do that. Actually, before we move on, I just realized there was one theme that I didn't mention, which I think we should, because it's another quite Saturn Neptune manifestation, which is that I've also noticed that at these Saturn Neptune conjunctions, there's something of let's say, a thinning of the veil as well. If we have Saturn being concrete manifest reality, and Neptune being the ideal realm, then these two planets coming together, they seem to make reality a bit more Neptunian. They bring spirit into reality. There's manifestations of spirit, or strange events or uncanny things that happen. For example, 1917, we had the miracle of Fatima, which is this extremely famous miracle that happened in Fatima, Portugal. There were these 3 shepherd children that were seeing visions of the Virgin Mary. And then there was this event called the Miracle of the Sun, where a huge crowd of people saw this really amazing and very weird display in the sky, where the sun seemed to dance in the sky, and there were all these multicolored lights and all this sort of stuff. And the Fatima miracle really did shape history in interesting ways as well, because the apparition of Mary gave these secrets to the children. One of them was having to do with with Russia and its consecration to the Catholic religion, or something of that kind. And it really influenced Catholic thought about Russia, I think. And years down the line, the Pope ended up playing quite an important role in the end of the Soviet Union. So it was this kind of weird event that happened back in 1917, a spirit manifestation that had these really big consequences for the world. And so you do get these kind of strange events, these like uncanny events. 1952, another one of these conjunctions, we had this sighting of loads of flying saucers around the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., a huge, extremely famous UFO manifestation that was seen by tons of people. So that theme comes up as well with these Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. UFOs, fallen angels, like these kinds of strange manifestations. So there's also that as well. So that's kind of like the sort of wild card part of this as well. I would be looking out for strange happenings as well as some of these like more mundane things that we've been talking about. But yeah, the question you asked, to get back to it, what comes next? It's difficult to answer, because I prefer to think in terms of scenarios. Really, I don't really like to tell people this is what's going to happen, because I don't know. All I can do is interpret the symbols, look at history, and make a kind of reasonable conjecture. And that's all I try to do. And I try to put forward scenarios rather than tell people this is what's happening. Yeah. So with that in mind, well, we have to think about Saturn-Neptune conjunction and the history of Russia. All right, we're probably going to get some important milestone in Russian history. And the question is really, what is that milestone going to be? If you look at the pattern in the past, there were changes in regime that were signified by these Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. So you have to consider that being a possibility somehow. Does something change in terms of who's ruling Russia? Does something happen to Vladimir Putin or something of that kind? Right? You can't rule that out. And at the same time, another possibility is just that the border of Russia, somehow this Ukraine conflict ends over the course of the next year or year and a half. It might not necessarily end exactly with Saturn Neptune very close to each other, but perhaps as Saturn moves away from Neptune, whether it's in the middle of 2026 or even later in 2027, perhaps the war could end and there'll be a new kind of crystallization of the border of Russia. Something that I saw researching Russian history is that whenever these conjunctions happen, besides the events that we already talked about, there tends to be a theme of Russia's borders being reset. So they change somehow. Russia, or it forges new alliances. There's something usually happens to the extent of Russia, which is this kind of, it's this enormous country, and where its border with the West, with Europe, should be, has never really been agreed on. And that's what's being fought over now, really, in Ukraine. So we could see an end to that conflict. And that's another possibility. So maybe a kind of like hardening of the border between Russia and the West somehow. You could see maybe that this is possibly the falling of a new Iron Curtain, which we saw at the start of the Cold War between the West and East. And one of the frames that I'm using to look at what's happening is that we're entering a new Cold War. I'm kind of hoping that that's the case rather than some worse possibilities, which you'll also hear people talking about. People talk about World War III breaking out in 2026, and it's not out of the question. Right? You'd be foolish to ignore that as a possibility. There are quite a lot of Aries war signals coming in, particularly in the first third of the year, up to around between now and April. Things look really fiery and intense. And even at the end of January, there is a big pileup of planets in early Aquarius, which includes Mars and Pluto, which are quite violent, aggressive planets, especially when they're together. And that pileup of planets is hitting the charts of Russia and China quite directly. And this is in the second half of January, coming quite soon. So you have to wonder what that's about. And yeah, there were quite a few signals of quite a lot of Aries energy. It's particularly getting into April. So my two, scenarios or major scenarios are that it's kind of signaling the real hardening of this sort of second Cold War. There's another, but then there's also signs of kind of internal conflict in a lot of places. And you have to look at what happened when we got the taster of this in 2025. We had Saturn and Neptune going into Aries, and we saw this conflict between the federal and state governments in the US. You kind of have to expect that that's probably going to intensify. And then you saw this escalation in the Ukraine conflict, including allegedly an attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin. So, all sorts of things are on the table. China, Taiwan could be also on the table for an intensification. I don't think China would necessarily invade Taiwan at this point. I don't think they would need to do that. But I don't rule anything out. But they might put a lot more pressure on Taiwan. They might maybe impose some sort of blockade or make things a lot harder for Taiwan. So there are all these possibilities. Of course, we've got what's happening in Iran right now. I would probably expect the US and or Israel to get involved in that at some point in the not too distant future, because both Israel and the US, they want to see the fall of the Islamist regime in Iran, and they'll probably do stuff to try and push that. Right, there's a lot of disorder right there now, so making problems for the government of Iran, attacking the country and so forth. All of that is, I think, possible. So that's the kind of scary kind of war side, and I kind of have to say that stuff because I can't really brush it under the carpet if I'm talking about mundane astrology. But there's also some things that I find much more exciting in that I think we're kind of going into some sort of spiritual revolution. I've called it a new Copernican revolution at times, meaning that we're coming to realize, and I say we, some people have never forgotten this, right? And some peoples have never forgotten this. But particularly in the West, we've had this period of kind of denying the realities of spirit for a long time. And Western science and ways of thinking have basically just been extremely materialistic and said there is no such thing as spirit, and matter is primary and so forth. And I think that is in the process of getting overturned. And it's similarly, the astrology now is similar to what happened in the 1540s when Copernicus published his heliocentric theory, which essentially said that the sun was the center of the solar system, not the earth. And that was a huge decentering of humanity. And I think we're going to see another decentering of humanity over the next few years, from now through to the 2030s, which involves coming to understand that we are not the only intelligent beings involved in this planet, whether that's through sort of recognition of something of the reality of the UFO phenomenon, which seems to be a manifestation of some form of consciousness, whether it's physical nuts and bolts beings coming from other star systems. I'm not sure I believe that. Or spiritual forces that can manifest physically if they want, but they also represent other intelligences that are active on Earth. And I think we're lining up for an understanding that those intelligences are present and that it's gradually going to seep more and more into the culture. And again, I want to stress, I know probably a lot of people watching this are going to be like, well, that's not news to me, and I understand that, but it is kind of new for a lot of people and for the culture generally. And so I think that might be part of what's coming. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the things we see in 2026 are really drive that. Also, in terms of our ancient history, I'm going quite woo-woo now,
That's
Heather.
okay. I like
Yeah,
it.
Atlantis, Egypt, that kind of thing. I think there are going to be more revelations from Egypt, ancient Egypt. And I think another thing you can kind of see growing in the culture is this recognition that perhaps this is not the only cycle that humanity has ever lived through, that we've been through previous cycles. People call previous civilizations Atlantis, but it doesn't really matter if you use that word. The idea that we've kind of been here before and that there are bigger cycles at work. And one of the many pieces of evidence for that is the advancement of the ancient Egyptians and the Great Pyramid. We've seen these really interesting revelations from Egypt in 2025, where this team of researchers, these Italian researchers, have used satellite radar to essentially see into the ground beneath the pyramids. And they believe they've established that there are these very huge structures extending like almost a kilometer, perhaps hundreds of meters, certainly, beneath the pyramids in Giza. And really suggesting, if their information is right, that there's far more to Egypt and that they're far more advanced than people give them credit for. And I think this year we could see much more from Egypt. There's an eclipse in August at 20 degrees of Leo, which is conjunct a few asteroids related to the Egyptian religion. And it's also conjunct the charts of some of the kind of, let's call them sort of spiritual teachers of the 19th and 20th centuries, people like Helena Blavatsky, Edgar Cayce, Rudolf Steiner, who all talked a lot about this kind of stuff and were people who drove a kind of the new, say, from behind, they drove the new age and recognition of the realities of spirit and of our ancient past. They all talked about Atlantis and things like that. So I'm wondering if we're going to, a lot more crazy, very interesting, exciting stuff is going to come out on these subjects as well in 2026.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's kind of been leading up to that. I mean, especially in the last few years, because it's really not like a cut and dry, like Saturn has moved into Aries and Neptune has moved into Aries, and it's like this is the date and everything happens right now. It even with Saturn, it's kind of a bleed through, right? Like everything is happening in this progressive cycle. There's no actual line in the sky that says like this is the moment. And even with the Egypt stuff and the like looking at ancient history and these cycles, we've had like ancient apocalypse becoming really popular on Netflix with like Graham Hancock, and we've had all these like little mini disclosures. And yeah, I think
Yeah.
that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, every moment bleeds into the next, and so new cycles are always being started, and everything is following on from what's gone before. So these conjunctions are more like, say, punctuation marks, maybe we could think of them. But yeah, the story has been ongoing for a long time, and I try to look at what's happening in the planets and in the world and see kind of the lineup between them to sort of try and divine what the trends are and what direction things are going in. And I've seen what you just mentioned quite heavily in the culture. We've seen, as you say, Graham Hancock's becoming very, very well known after a very long career of like banging on about this stuff and being, mocked and ignored and all of that kind of thing by the establishment. But he's kind of having his moment, and those ideas are huge now. And there's so many podcasts say that the kind of things that people are talking about on pretty popular podcasts are just pretty crazy these days. All sorts of stuff, all related to spirit, ancient history, UFOs, all this kind of thing. They think about the Joe Rogan podcast and similar podcasts. They get into this sort of stuff a lot, and I suspect this is a little bit of this kind of Aries vibe as well. There's we're watching kind of new beliefs about the world and possibility really coming into their own around this time. And I think this is also the start of the Neptune cycle, right? Neptune is moving into Aries. It's the start of its circuit around the zodiac. And I've noticed that at key points in the Neptune cycle, you see shifts in our kind of collective beliefs about the world. So that's another thing that's really dialed into the times with that refreshment of the Neptune cycle, new beliefs about what's possible. And yeah, the Aries is very much about the new and innovation and just following the will where it takes you and following the spirit. So there's an element of that as well. I see, that podcast space where they're getting into all that stuff. It's quite, it's been bubbling under for quite a long time, getting more and more popular and competing more and more with the mainstream media. And that feels to me like kind of Aries manifestation as well. It's quite like I don't know if you know what I mean when I say blokey in some ways. Like so a lot of the biggest names are like kind of quite the sort of they're men, they're young men, or not so
Okay.
young men like
Sorry,
Joe
I'm not
Rogan.
British. I didn't understand. Thank you for the explanation for our American viewers.
Yeah, blokey. Like Rogan,
I learned a new
Rogan,
word.
and Rogan is like, you know, he's an MMA guy. He's into fight
Yeah.
sports as well. That's very Aries, right? It's sort of masculine, warrior like, but they're also bringing in this new openness to these kind of weirder topics, which I expect will spread much more over the coming years. So yeah, that's definitely another part of the times, and it's kind of the part that I would kind of much rather just focus on the new woo and the sort of changing consciousness. But we have all this quite scary geopolitical stuff going on as well. So it's a bit like everything all at once
Mhm.
this year. I think there'll be reasons to be uh, optimistic, and things will also be pretty intense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I like the idea of focusing on the woo, which isn't super woo, and like the potential that could come out of this. And so I feel like that's a really good spot to kind of end on. Is there anything that you would say before we sign off that on a personal level for our viewers who are sovereign individuals with some semblance of free will, at least, that we could be doing to kind of prepare for this energy? What would be your top thing?
I think there's a huge be yourself energy coming with Saturn and Neptune in Aries. It's kind of a complicated situation because there are also other indicators that new collectives can be formed, but collectives with new identities. Like it's kind of time to maybe disconnect a bit from the internet if you can, and from social media and things of that kind, because that's been a real characteristic of the Neptune and Pisces era. And we've all been kind of swimming in these collective waters and picking up on each other's ideas, some of which we might like and many of which we don't like, and hence all the kind of the conflicting energy over the years. It's a real time to kind of find yourself, I think, and find who you are and disconnect from that kind of illusory Neptunian realm and touch grass, as they say, find out like and reconnect with who you are beyond this illusory social media world that we've been inhabiting. And I think doing that, I think I would also say, think about authenticity is like a big keyword. Be authentic. It's like the kind of the era of the image has passed a little bit. It's about who you really are. If you're somebody who's, say, running a business, or you're involved in your say social media somehow, or things of that kind, think in terms of bringing authenticity to what you do and how you present yourself. It's a time to kind of just be yourself, be raw, don't hold back so much, because I think if you do that, you'll be kind of vibing with the times much more.
Yeah, I love that. That's a perfect end note and excellent advice for the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries. I know our viewers are definitely going to want to find you. So if they want to do that, where can they find you?
They can find me here on YouTube uh, at World Astrology Report. And they can also find me on Substack. I'm writing a series of essays called The Hermetic Age at the moment. And you can find me there. It's also Substack, World Astrology Report. And you can find me on Instagram as well, World Astrology Report. So I'm in those places.
Yeah, I'm going to drop all of those links down below. You're definitely going to want to watch Dan's videos. They are absolutely brilliant. They're probably the only mundane astrology videos that I can really handle watching these days because so many people get so into their own political opinions and their own ideas about things, and they tend to infuse that into the astrology, but the astrology doesn't really care about your political opinions. And so I love your approach because it's so balanced and still very truthful and very authentic to who you are, but without being pushy in that way. And so I know our viewers are looking for that. I know so many people are looking for that. So thank you for bringing that into the world and into the YouTube land. And thank you so much for being here. This conversation was really fun, really enlightening. And yeah, we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. It was a pleasure, very fun. And yeah, I'd be happy to come back and talk again.
All right. Thank you so much.